Welcome to the 9th lecture of our course, and the title of today's lecture is Universal Grammar. So today we will be talking about these issues. Initially we will be talking about the nature and nurture debate. Then we will talk about the Chomsky and Skinner debate, and we will ask this question whether the data from animal behavior is helpful for us to understand the nature of language. We will also talk about the idea of blank slate in relation to children's language acquisition. We will talk about two different kinds of universals. You will learn what universals are and what are the different types, and then we will be talking about two-tier system of the universal grammar. So initially let us start the class by asking the simple question which may come to your mind for various reasons. Whether nature or nurture, which is the primary factor for the language acquisition or the knowledge of language, as we are putting it mostly. So if you ask this question, is language natural for human beings, now you have some answer in your mind, right? By now you have figured out that we are talking about a human language only, and these have certain features, and we are talking about these features for last few classes. And there is a problem with this statement. If we say that language is natural to human beings, it is like coming naturally to us. You can say that no, there is a role of environment as well. How can you ignore the role of the environment? You cannot say that it is only natural and environment has no roles. So the question which is asked by many philosophers, psychologists, linguists, and people from the other domain of cognitive science is whether children are born with blank slates. So what does it mean? Whether the mind is absolutely clear, there is nothing it's there, and children will learn language afresh. Instead of this idea, you can say that children have a programming. They are programmed with the capacity for language. So children have certain kind of capacity, and we already talked about it in the previous classes. Now the question is whether language is available to us by nature, it's there inside us, or we learn it through nurture, through the environment which is available to us. We already talked about Chomsky's idea and how Chomsky attacked the behaviorists. So I mentioned briefly the name of Skinner, B.F. Skinner, who wrote a work called Verbal Behavior, and Chomsky did a review of verbal behavior in 1959, where he said that language is not done by imitation. You already learnt about it. So Skinner, if you are familiar with the experiments in the behaviorist trend, you know that Skinner experimented with some animals like rats and pigeons, and it's established that they learn by trial and error. And if you remember the term operant conditioning from your school biology or advanced biology, if you have read, what does this mean? What is the meaning of operant conditioning? It means that there is some sort of training by the help of voluntary responses. So Chomsky attacked this idea that it's something else, it's not only imitation, and in the behaviorist trend, we also say that in order to understand language, we need to identify the relevant variables which control our learning of language. It means there are certain variables, external variables, which are controlling language, and that is how we can explain or define language. So there is an argument in this domain. You can say that humans are puzzle solvers and language is a puzzle. So humans have high level of intelligence which can help them to solve the puzzle, and this is how we can explain the complexity of language and the capacity of language. We already talked about the innateness hypothesis, if you remember, and the criticism against the views of behaviorists is that language is not a set of habits. There is a criticism. It's not a set of habits, it's something else, and we will be talking about this complexity again. And for talking about this complexity, we will also go back to certain concepts that we have discussed previously. Humans have an innate knowledge, you know that is talked about the innateness hypothesis, and again we are referring to this term knowledge of language, where we are knowledge of language is a part of the child's biological endowment and part of the structure of the language faculty. So, why we are saying biological endowment, whether we can term language as a biological product or not is the question, and it's the structure of the language faculty. We will come to this idea of language faculty later, but now we will be emphasizing on this idea of biological behavior in today's class. So, humans are genetically imprinted with knowledge of language. This is something that we mentioned previously. We are emphasizing this idea again. If you ask why innate, why we are saying that it's innate, it's not children are actually not born with a blank slate. To put it in a different way, there is some kind of genetic programming. Human beings are genetically programmed for language. Children are not ready to speak just after they are born, but they have a blueprint. They have a blueprint in their mind which helps them to acquire language. This is something that we have to be clear about. And you can think about an analogy of a seed, where seed has a capacity to grow. So, we can say that the blueprint of language which is there inside our head, it has the capacity to develop language. Chomsky talked about a very different definition of language that all of us knew and we discussed before. Now, we are talking about an organ for language, which is a new concept indeed. Chomsky said that we have a specialized organ which is meant for language, and it can be differentiated from the body. So, I will ask you to pay attention to this term specialized organ, because this is a new concept and very important concept for our purpose, and we will again come back to this concept while discussing the initial lectures. And all of us know that language is a system. We talked about it previously, and we can now say that it's easy to isolate this system among the various mental faculties. So, there are different types of mental faculties, and it is possible to figure out language as a separate system if you consider the different mental faculties. This is something which is very important. So, I am quoting Chomsky here, language grows in mind or brain. This is very important for us to remember, because it is of course related to the new definition of language, but it also changed the way in which we used to think about language, if you remember the definitions that we have already discussed. Today we will also talk about some information from the domain of animal behaviors, which is of course coming from the discipline of evolutionary biology and psychology. So, if you ask this simple question, do animals talk? You may stop and think about various examples. Some animals who try to talk or who imitate human beings, who are trained to talk, for example. I am sure you are having several examples in your mind, right? Dolphins, maybe birds, some birds, etc. So, if we ask about the simple question, do animals talk? I will ask you to go back to the class where you learnt about certain features of language. I am sure that you thought about this idea, whether human language is different from animal communication in terms of the features that you have learnt while talking about the characteristic features. So, I have given only one example here, displacement. What is displacement? Human beings can talk about something which has happened in past, or which is happening now at present, or which will happen in future. Human beings can also talk about something which is absolutely imaginary. Human beings can talk about something which is false. This characteristic features is formally termed as displacement. If you think about animal communications, this feature is not there. Maybe to some extent you can think about some kind of properties that is conveyed through displacement, but animal communication does not have displacement as a feature. So, you can think about more features which are coming to your mind, and if you are interested you can of course go through the literature where people are talking about animal communication and difference with human communication. Parrots are taught languages, and all of us have experienced parrots imitating human beings and saying something. But now when you are developing a very new definition of language, and when we are saying again and again that language is exclusively human, and we are relating it to the innateness hypothesis, to a faculty and a mental organ, now I am sure you are thinking twice about the factor parrots are imitating someone, whether we can really term it as language or not. You can also think about chimpanzees who learned sign languages. If you are familiar with some case studies where chimpanzees were taught sign language, and we will see what exactly happened. This is a photo of Washoe, a very well known chimpanzee, and in 1960s American psychologists did a number of experiments with chimps, and experiments for language was a major part. Some of the chimpanzees were formally taught sign language, specifically the American Sign Language ASL, and some of the chimps also learned to press the keyboard in order to communicate through some particular symbols, of course. So, Washoe could use ASL in 1966, and psychologists tried to decode the symbols and the series of symbols that Washoe used in order to understand whether we can really term it as language in the sense we are defining language in the Chomskyan sense, and whether we can also prove Chomsky as wrong. So, Washoe could use language, but there was a problem in her communication. She used to ask for something which is very different from the content. So, it's quite random. So, this context dependence is very important if you think about the communication of the chimps. This is Neem Chimsky. You can understand from the name why he was named as Neem Chimsky. People who tried to attack Noam Chomsky for his path-breaking definition of language, they named him as Neem. So, Project Neem is a very well-known work in the domain of behavioral psychology, and Neem could do something which Washoe couldn't. Neem used certain sequences in the speech. So, there were 2-word sequences, 3-word sequences, and also 4-word sequences which were found in Neem's speech. So, I have listed 4 examples here, you can read them. Banana Neem eat, banana eat Neem, me Neem eat, me more eat. So, you can understand that there are different grammatical categories. By grammatical category I mean noun, verb, etc. in the speech pattern, and then there are different combinations as well, but certain things are missing. I am not asking you which part is missing, but you can ask yourself and also make it a point that why those parts are missing here and what is so special about it. It is very important for us to notice that Neem's experiment happened in 1970s when Chomsky was actually creating his path-breaking theories, and people who were experimenting with Neem, they found that Neem could not contribute to give and take conversations. There were some kind of limitations in Neem's speech pattern. So, we learned certain things from animal communication through experiments with chimpanzees, and you can also make your own note whichever is important for yourself. Now, I will introduce you to the idea of Eric Lenneberg, who was basically from medical background. He was in Harvard Medical School, and he wrote a very important book where he said that language is a biological behavior. It was done in 1967. So we have been viewing language as a biological product from and we are talking about it from different perspectives, the basic perspectives of course. If you are coming from biological sciences background, then you know more about it, but we are talking about the issues relevant to language only. So when Lenneberg termed language as a biological behavior, this position is very close to Chomsky's position, right? So Lenneberg talked about a few new ideas. I'll give some examples. He said that children begin to talk when the surroundings remain unchanged. So there is no external input which is creating a huge impact, because you know no external events can affect this behavior. This is a behavior and external events cannot affect this much, and direct teaching is irrelevant. So we have been talking about some data from child language previously. So if you think about some child language data which is available to you, maybe some kid who is there in front of you saying something, probably you have noticed that direct teaching doesn't help, and children go through some milestones or developmental stages when they acquire language, and these milestones are predictable. Language is a biological behavior where you can clearly predict the milestones based on the age of the children. So by the age of 2.5, children can use a few hundred words. So people who work in the domain of developmental psycholinguistics, they worked in detail about these milestones in different languages. If you are interested in developmental psycholinguistics, maybe you can read more later. So now we will try to link Lenneberg's idea with Chomsky's idea, because both of them are giving this idea that language is a biological product. Chomsky said that children have a rich innate schema. So this is something that we are saying again. We talked about the innateness hypothesis, but please notice how I am putting it, rich innate schema. This is very important, these expressions. And we can say that children are not born with blank sheets or blank slates. Here Chomsky borrowed the idea of the very well known 18th century rationalist philosopher René Descartes. Descartes gave the theory of innate ideas. Chomsky borrowed from him and created the innateness hypothesis for language, and he said that anyone who is using a language is not accumulating random utterances. So we have been talking about it in different ways, right? Human beings learn a set of rules. They produce infinite utterance with the help of the rules. We already had a class specifically on rules. I hope you remembered them when we talked about rules. What all did we say? If you want to go back to the previous lecture, you can go back and come back here again. So children have an internalized grammar. There is a construction of an internalized grammar, and the grammar is there. What we are saying or following Chomsky is the children find regularities in the surrounding languages. So the blueprint is there. They will just try to find the regularities and make generalization of the pattern. So at this point, if we ask the question regarding nature and nurture, again we will be saying that nature and nurture both are important. We cannot say that only one is sufficient. Surrounding data is important too. So now I will be coming to the idea of wired knowledge and the universals, because we are talking about UG or universal grammar today. Let me introduce you to the idea of universals, which has been discussed by Chomsky in his 1965 work. So human beings know what is possible and what is impossible in languages. So this is actually I am talking about the constraints. I hope you remember that we talked about the constraints previously. you cannot have any random construction. There are certain constraints which will be basically shaping your language. So, tacit knowledge of linguistic universals is important for us. That is the point that we are making now. We talked about tacit knowledge or unconscious knowledge in previous classes, and now we are talking about linguistic universals. Chomsky says that there are two types of universals. One is substantial universal and the other is formal universal. I will request you to pay attention here because this is extremely important for us to know, and later we will be talking about the idea of universal in language from a different perspective. So, at that point you can come back to this lecture and try to see how these two ideas of universals are theoretically different. So, substantial universals are basically the building blocks of the knowledge, linguistic knowledge. And what do I mean by building blocks? You remember what we said initially while talking about the levels of language. There are different kinds of items which can be considered as the building blocks. And there are formal universals which are related to the shape of the grammar. Here we are talking about the rules, right, when we are saying formal universals. So, we talked about Saussure in the other classes. Saussure gave an analogy of the game of chess. He said that you can have different elements while playing the chess, but the rule remains the same. So, you can think about the analogy at this point and say that the building blocks of the knowledge can change, but the forms are the same, the rules are the same. You can change the elements which you are using in order to create sentences, but the rules remain the same. Rules are very important, we cannot change them. We will know more about rules in a different way in today's class. So, children know how the internalized grammar is organized. It is an unconscious knowledge we already mentioned, but children really know a lot if you remember Plato's problem. And when we talk about rules, we can say that it must have a set of rules related to the sound patterns. Now, I will ask you to pay attention to the terms that I am using here, because we will be coming back to these terms and discuss these different domains in detail. So, this slide is super important for you, you have to pay attention to this. Sound patterns, which are phonological rules. So, by phonology we mean sound patterns, if you remember. And there is another set of rules which is related to meaning, which are semantic rules. These two rules or these two set of rules are linked by the syntactic rules. So, syntax is a domain which is the study of sentence structure and phrase structure in our languages. Syntax gets some kind of supremacy in the theoretical domain of linguistics, but we always talk about phonological rules and semantic rules when we talk about syntax. We cannot get rid of these two and talk about syntax alone. So, it is very important for us to understand and understand this model, how Chomsky is perceiving this idea that sound patterns and meaning, these are related through the syntactic rules. So, we already know about structure dependence. We did talk about structure dependence with examples. If you remember the examples of merge and move in the class of rules. So, these rules, the rules of language, they make structure dependent operations, and by operations I mean merge, move, etc. Certain kind of operations are always there when we create sentences. So, we said that there is a blueprint of language in our mind, and as a result we can talk, we can create infinite number of sentences. So, now I will ask you to pay attention to these four terms, linguistic universals that we have learned today, and there are of course substantial universal and formal universal. Then there is a hypothesis maker. So you have the universals, you have both substantial universal and formal universal, and then you make certain hypotheses on the basis of the universals. Then certain kind of evaluation procedures are there, and then you have the grammar or universal grammar or UG. So it's very important for us to understand how people are explaining the blueprint of language. So how is universal grammar? If you ask this question, we can say that UG or universal grammar is a two-tier system. It's another very important theoretical idea that I am asking you to pay attention to, because when we will be doing syntax, we will be coming back to this in the very beginning. It's a very important concept for us to know. So there is a basic layer of universal principles which is applicable for all languages, and second layer is partially wired. It contains a finite set of operations which are based on observations. These are known as parameters. So parameters need to be fixed by experience, and principles are applicable for all languages. This is known as the principles and parameters approach. This theory was given by Chomsky in the 1980s, and there are several modules. We can talk about it briefly in the classes, syntax classes later. But for now, it's very important for us to remember that there is something called a principle and something called parameters, and it's important. One is universal, one is not. I'll also tell you that after the principles and parameters theory, Chomsky took a newer approach. I am not naming the approach now because you will be learning about them later. But the idea is that there is a lexicon. By lexicon I mean something related to the vocabulary. So lexicon that feeds into the computational system. We are coming back to computational system. In the very beginning we did talk about the fact that language is often perceived at the computational system now. So it feeds into the computational system which check the word combinations that fit the basic principle. So basic principle means the universal principles which are applicable for all languages. So this computational system will check the word combinations that fit the basic principle. This is very important for us. And if you remember the child language data, I have one more set of data for you. Want the other one spoon, daddy? You mean you want the other spoon? Yes, I want other one spoon, please, daddy. Can you say the other spoon? Other one spoon. Say other. Child says other. Father says spoon. Child says spoon. Then father says other spoon. The child again says other spoon. Now give me the other one spoon. So direct teaching is not helping, and from child language data we actually understand that external teaching is not helping us. It's something else which will gradually develop. So do children have the puzzle solving equipment which enable them to process data? It's very important for us to know. But I am positing a very small question for you which you can answer for yourself and keep it for yourself. What happens if a child knows 2 or more languages? How do they generalize the inputs? Is it same for other different languages, like the idea of parameter you are like just being introduced to, or it is universal? So this question is a big question in the domain of bilingual brain research and bilingualism and universal grammar kind of research area where people talked about nature of bilingual grammar. So I'll introduce you to one more concept and then wrap up today's class. I am talking about this idea because we will be introducing the idea of faculty of language in the next class. So Chomsky, Hauser and Fitch in 2002 wrote a very important piece of article in the Science magazine where they said that in order to define language we need the help of evolutionary biology, anthropology, psychology and neuroscience. And they said that we need to talk about the idea of faculty of language from two different senses. One is a broad sense and a narrow sense. So, faculty of language in a broad sense is FLB, and faculty of language in a narrow sense is FLN. So, they said that faculty of language in a narrow sense includes recursion and only human components, and it may have evolved for reason other than language. So, here evolutionary biology and psychology also comes in the picture, and we need to understand that there are computational systems outside the domain of language. For example, you can say number or navigation, even social relations. So, these are computational systems which are outside the domain of language. If you are coming from a cognitive science background, that then these are known to you. When we talk about the domain of language, we also learn from them, and when we do research in the domain of linguistics, we also help them to understand the other computational domains outside language. So, we will talk about this in detail in the next class. So, coming to the conclusion, we talked about the fact that there is a blueprint of the language in humans, and we also defined the idea of blueprint. We said that we have a specialized organ for language. We are Chomsky is terming it as an organ. We have a language organ. We learned certain ideas from animal behaviors, and understood that there are certain limitations of animal communication which will help us to understand the nature of human language. We talked about Lenneberg's idea of language as a biological behavior, and try to see whether the idea of biological behavior is also linked to Chomskyan concepts. And we talked about two different kinds of universals, substantial and formal universals, and we said that these will be very much important for us to understand, because in order to know the principles and parameters approach. So, in principles and parameters approach, if you remember, there are some rules which are applicable for all languages, which is known as principles, and there are certain parameters which are applicable for specific languages. So, we will end the class. I hope you will revise all these ideas again, and if needed, go back to the previous lectures. So, in the next class, we will be talking about faculty of language in detail. These are the key references. Thank you.